there seems to be kind of a curious gap in the teaching of U.S. history for that period that comes after the War of 1812, but before the Civil War, the period called the Antebellum period. And while we don't talk about that period all that much, that period between 1820 and 1860 really largely defined the nation, stretching newfound muscle, the nation's politics, its demographics, its geography, its economy, and its culture transformed radically during that period, offering new opportunities but also new challenges. And the stresses of all those changes seem to come together in May of 1849 in the nation's largest city over the most pressing issue of the day. Who played the best Macbeth? The Shakespeare riot of 1849 is history that deserves to be remembered. The United States experienced enormous growth in the first half of the 19th century. Between 1800 and 1850, the population in the United States more than quadrupled from 5.3 million to over 23 million. While most of the growth was internal natural growth in an area of high birth rates and low mortality rates, as the 19th century progressed, the nation saw an ever-increasing number of immigrants. In the decade between 1820 and 1829, the nation welcomed some 128,000 immigrants. In the decade 1840 to 1849, that number had grown to more than 1.4 million. Many were Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine. Some 60% of those immigrants entered through New York City. The city was growing in a period of rapid urbanization. In 1810, not one city in the United States had a population over 100,000. By 1850, nearly a third of the U.S. population lived in a city with a population over 100,000. The population of New York City was around 80,000 at the turn of the 19th century, but by 1850 it was nearly 700,000. The rapid urbanization was driven by rapid industrialization, creating entirely new economic classes and new economic stresses. One trend of particular note was the growth of a class of the extremely wealthy. In 1844, poet Nathaniel Parker Willis coined the term the upper 10,000. Willis was using the term as a compliment, but the term quickly became a point of contention. While the upper tens represented the opportunity in the nation, John Jacob Astor, the richest man in America and America's first multimillionaire, had made a fortune in the fur trade, but had started in America working in a butcher shop. The measure between the privileged few and the teeming masses was becoming more obvious. A verse from an 1863 song by popular vaudevillian Tony Pastor said, "The upper 10,000 wear jewels and lace, but the lower 10,000 have rags in their place." Meanwhile, industrialization was growing a working class that was benefiting from rising wages and newly found expendable income. In New York, a working class culture grew, epitomized by the so-called Bowery boys and gals. The name derived from the street and neighborhood of New York called the Bowery, which had started as a neighborhood of the wealthy, but by the 1830s was a neighborhood of the working class. While certainly rough and tumble, the Bowery boys and gals were also proud. They developed distinct styles of dress, spoke in a kind of street slang, and had a reputation for being rowdy and boisterous. A European visitor described them. "Who are the boys and gals of New York? Sometimes a stout clerk in a jobbing house, oftener a junior partner at a wholesale grocery, and still more frequently a respectable young butcher with big arms and broad shoulders, in a blue coat with a silk hat and a crape wound about its base." In many ways, they represented the very nature of the brash young nation. They loved independence and freedom, valued loyalty and patriotism, and had a disdain for the aristocracy. They saw the growing trend of immigration as a threat to their wages. They could turn towards violence, and the Bowery Boys was a term for various New York street gangs that were anti-immigrant, anti-Irish, and anti-Catholic, and brawled with other gangs. And one place where the cultures met was at the place where people of all classes sought entertainment and diversion, the theater. In its growth, the U.S. had struggled to develop its own theatrical traditions. There was not yet a quintessential American theater voice. But the character of the theater was changing along with the changing nation. The Bowery Boys were avid but rowdy theater goers. If they liked a song or dance, they would demand that the performers repeat it. If they disliked an act, they might hiss or catcall or throw rotten vegetables. In contrast to the more well-heeled clientele, they drank, smoked, and cavorted with prostitutes at the theater. There were various views of this clientele. Frances Trollope, a British author who published her experience traveling in America under the title Domestic Manners of the Americans, decried the incessant spitting and the mixed smell of onions and whiskey. But poet Walt Whitman had a more romanticized view of the noble working-class theater audience, packed from ceiling to pit with its audience, mainly of alert, well-dressed, full-blooded young and middle-aged men, the best average of American-born mechanics. And into this atmosphere came the egos of two of the greatest actors of their times. William Charles Macready was considered perhaps the greatest British actor of his generation, and Edwin Forrest was the first truly American stage star. Growing up in a time when most stage actors in America were British, Edwin Forrest began his theatrical career traveling through rough theaters of the American West before having great success at the Bowery Theater in New York in 1826. The newspaper The National Advocate said of his performance of Shakespeare's Othello at just the age of 21, "There is not the slightest doubt in our minds, but Mr. Forrest may reach the highest ranks of drama." What set Forrest apart was what the Advocate referred to as natural spirit. He played a more boisterous, robust, and frankly, American version of Shakespeare. A decade later, he was one of the most famous actors in America and seen by many to be the very embodiment of American theater when he traveled to England to perform in the country of Shakespeare. There he found general success, although not universal approval of the British press. And there he also made the acquaintance of William Charles Macready, considered by most to be not just the greatest actor of the day in England, but also in a successful tour in the United States. Macready was complimentary of Forrest, according to the Advocate, even if his supporters in the press were not. The two formed something of a rivalry. When Macready had a second tour of the United States in 1843, Forrest contrived to play in theaters in the same cities, giving audiences, in essence, a choice of the American or the British version of Shakespeare. The rivalry was generally good-natured, and both found success in their tour, even as American papers tended to prefer their native son. The rivalry turned sour, however, when Forrest returned to England in 1845 to less success, especially with his portrayal of Macbeth. Forrest became convinced that Macready and his supporters were conspiring against him. Forrest heckled one of Macready's performances, and the British press turned against him, carrying on an ugly back and forth between Forrest and the editors of the London newspaper, The Times. So when William Macready returned to the United States in 1848 for another theatrical tour, the rivalry was more than just a challenge between the egos of two actors. It was really seen in the United States as representing the challenges of the times. It was a matter of patriotism and pride. Francis Trollope had complained that the American working class theater audiences were so patriotic that if Yankee Doodle was called for, they seemed to think that their reputation as a citizen depended upon the amount of noise that they made. It was seen as that contest between nativists and Europeans, and especially the English, the hatred of whom even the Bowery Boys and Irish immigrants agreed upon. It was seen as that challenge between the upper tens and the working class, and the difference between the populist Jacksonian Democrats and their more conservative Whig rivals. The particular bone of contention, it seems, was that Forrest's supporters found it offensive that Macready had failed to invite Forrest to visit his home when he was in England in 1845. Newspapers happily stoked the flames of the rivalry as it sold papers. Forrest supporters promised to hiss Macready off the stage, but found only limited success in places like Boston and Philadelphia, where Macready was still popular enough among theatergoers to receive a civil reception. The Boston newspaper The Bee lamented the rivalry and poor treatment of Macready, even as they opined that we desire to see less art and more nature than Mr. Macready throws into his style. But New York was the center of Forrest's support, and the feud was coming to a head when Macready was scheduled to play Macbeth in what was billed as his last performance in the United States at the Astor Opera House on May 7, 1849. Opened in 1847, the Astor Opera House was intended specifically to exclude the rowdy patrons of Bowery Street. Originally intended to only offer opera, the Astor House's higher ticket prices and strict dress code that required white gloves and evening dress was aiming for an audience of the upper tens. Forrest's supporters bought hundreds of tickets to Macready's performance and attacked him with a wave of hisses and rotten vegetables, while the rest of the audience shouted "Shame, shame" at the rabble-rousers. The actors had to continue the play in pantomime, as the audience could not hear them over the noise. Finally, the theater drew the curtain, as the audience members had started to throw chairs. This was a sorry display, to be sure, but would likely have been written off just as frontier manners, had a group of New York elite, who took the behavior of the mob as an embarrassment to the city, not signed a petition for Macready to complete his engagement, arguing that the good sense and respect for order prevailing in this community will sustain you on the subsequent nights of your performance. Thus, Macready was scheduled for a final performance on May 10th. The situation was not just inflamed by the theatrical rivalry and conflicts of the times. Earlier that year, a Whig, Caleb Smith Woodhull, had won the mayoral election in New York. The Tammany Democrats saw an opportunity to gain political points and embarrass Woodhull by further inflaming the working class crowd. Tammany supporters distributed handbills asking, "Shall Americans or English rule this city?" The police warned the mayor that they did not have the resources to quell a serious riot, and the mayor mobilized 300 members of the militia. A bloody confrontation was in the works. The night of the performance, more than 10,000 people filled the streets. They attacked the Astor House with bottles and bricks and had running battles with the police. The New York Tribune wrote, "The pieces of bricks and paving stones rattled in on the terraces and lobbies. The confusion increased till Opera House resembled a fortress besieged by an invading army rather than a place meant for the peaceful amusement of civilized community." Then, the rioters tried to set fire to the theater. As McCready slipped out the back in disguise, the mayor sent in the militia, afraid of losing control of the city. The crowd, venting the frustration that the poor half of the elite, attacked the militia with paving stones. Still, the mayor and police did not want to order the militia to fire, but the militia commanders explained that they would not just stand to be pelted with stones, and they had to be either allowed to fire or they would leave. Finally, the mayor gave the order. The first volley was fired above the crowd, and when the attacks did not stop, the next volley was into the crowd. The crowd regrouped and continued throwing stones. The militia finally had to bring up their cannon, the threat of which finally caused the crowd to disperse. 18 people were killed in the shooting, many of them bystanders. The Evening Post listed the casualties, included Bridget Fagan, Irish, 30 years old, shot in the left leg just below the knee, lives in 11th Street between Avenues 1 and 2. She was 2 blocks off, walking with her husband on their way home, fell into his arms. And Henry Otten, grocer, corner of Hester and Orchard Street, was shot through the stomach and died in the 15th Street Ward Station House while we were there. His aged mother was present, and her lamentations were truly heart-rending. Several more died of their wounds over the next few days. The New York Herald described the people killed. All were unanimous in that they lived in trying times in a very dangerous neighborhood. More than 50 police and 140 militia had also been injured. The Astor Place riot was the deadliest of numerous riots and insurrections that occurred in New York City during this tumultuous period and resulted in more civilian casualties due to military activity than had occurred in the United States since the Revolutionary War. Clashes between rioters and police continued for a couple of days, but were quelled by the presence of troops. A jury later acquitted the militia of any wrongdoing, arguing that their actions were justified, but 10 instigators of the riot were tried and convicted and served jail sentences. William McCready went back to England and never returned to the United States. He retired from acting in 1851 and died in 1873 at the age of 80. Edwin Forrest continued acting in the United States despite suffering partial paralysis due to gout. He died of a stroke in 1872 at the age of 66. The Astor Place riots had some important and long-term impacts on the United States. For example, New York City police officers were armed more heavily as a result of the Astor Place riots. But the Astor Place never recovered its reputation, became known as the Disaster Place, and it closed, and more upscale entertainment was moved uptown. American popular culture split between highbrow entertainment and entertainment for the working class, like vaudeville, and Shakespeare, which was once so popular among all classes in America that miners in California would stage impromptu Shakespearean plays based on memory, faded from American popular culture. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.